Yes, can see my screen?
I can
Yeah,
see
we
it.
can see
Yes, thank you.
Cool. For the next 15, 20 minutes, I'm going to take you through just sort of a quick 101 on blockchain and then some of the stuff that's happening in the Pacific Northwest, and particularly some of the things that we're working on. So I kind of hinted at some of these things earlier, but we'll go into a little bit more detail. So first, why blockchain? So some of you might, it sounds like some of you are already familiar with blockchain. So this is a very remedial, just kind of overview on sort of generally how it works and why we think it's cool. So this is a deck that this sort of next few slides is something that we've done a lot of investor education with, a lot of policymaker education with. So yeah, kind of, blockchain for dummies, as it were, I guess. So we're going to go back a ways. So before 1990, we had physical assets and didn't have to worry about all these digital assets creating headaches. So, if you were buying a car from someone, you're trying to figure out sort of a trusted third party that, or an escrow agent in this case, that can verify like, yes, this person has a car that is in working condition they can sell, and yes, this person has money they can buy the car with. So escrow basically creating trust at a distance. Fast forward to 2001, and we start having all these digital assets that, and Napster being one example, or just, music being one example, and you get all this rampant intellectual property piracy through things like, Napster, Kazaa, LimeWire, all that kind of stuff, which creates a problem. Then fast forward to, the last 10, 15 years, and everything is digital. So now we have a bigger problem because healthcare records, financial information, still music, but also, movies, TV shows, all that stuff is digital now. And so it creates challenges around basically making sure the people who can access it are the people that you want to be able to access it. So that's kind of where blockchain comes in. So how blockchain works, again, very remedial definition here. There's plenty of nuance and there's plenty of different blockchains out there, but sort of here's the gist. So each asset has a unique ID tied to a unique owner. When asset is transferred from A to B, that record of who owns the asset and the change of ownership is recorded across the entire blockchain network and all the computers. So, and each transfer is recorded in the ledger. So basically, it removes that sort of third party and instead says the network is going to create trust. So, one way to think about this is just like a Google sheet. I think this is probably the most simple definition of what a blockchain is, but each one of those cells in a Google sheet, we'll call it a block, can contain information. And so as you get a series of information, or in this case, transactions in that Google sheet, you have a chain of cells with information or a chain of blocks of information, blockchain. So really is just sort of a fancy database in a lot of ways, but it's very technically hard to achieve and creates a lot of cool efficiencies across all kinds of different, or in all kinds of different industries where there's all these sort of intermediaries, where there's a bunch of systems that aren't talking to each other. This allows you to sort of share that information with the people you want to share it with more quickly, or to transact with people that you want to transact with more quickly. And it creates actually, I think I have this next slide to summarize. So blockchain is like an escrow system, not exactly, but in this case, the example works, that ensures a secure and authenticated transfer of ownership of digital assets. And so, as you agree to the transaction and perform that, the transaction is recorded on a shared ledger with a, immutable, auditable history. So you can go back and look at that. And so, looking at fraud in this case, let's say, Nate and I'm buying a car from Nate, and, I say that I paid him and Nate's like, no, you didn't. We can go look at the blockchain, and like, if one of us is wrong, it'll be easy to see because the rest of the network also can validate what we're saying, or what the person who's right is saying. So it creates this trust from the network, and sort of helps eliminate counterfeiting, piracy of digital assets, and ensures the legitimate transfer of ownership. So, one example is in supply chain. So we're in Washington, we like apples. So, there's a lot of different people who touch the product between we're growing it on the tree to I'm buying it in the grocery store, and they all use different inventory systems, and they don't necessarily talk to each other. They're different, people, companies, different systems, like I said. And so when you're using blockchain, you can share that information across the entire network. And so as ownership goes from A to B to C to D to E to, onward, you can track the entire sort of supply chain of that apple. And if I get a bad apple, I can look at the QR code and quickly say, oh, this came from this farm and this tree. So it creates those efficiencies across those systems, and allows for basically better inventory management, more efficiency, quality control, provenance, tracking, all that kind of stuff. Another example, which we're particularly excited about is, and focusing on a lot, is identity. So I think the most, and shouts to Mick Levin for all the super bad fans out there. But so I think this is one that, again, kind of remedial example on how this works, but I think it sort of shows the power of blockchain as far as giving our information back to users, as opposed to being controlled by social media companies and others, or by EMR systems, all that kind of stuff. So when you walk into a bar, they just need to see, are you over 21 or not? And to figure that out, you hand them a driver's license or an ID that shows your height, your weight, your date of birth, your name, your address, all these different things, when all they need to know is, yes, they're over 21. And so the reason for that, or sort of a way that the blockchain can fix that, is by saying, cool, you get to access the information that you need to access, which is that I am over 21, but you don't get to see all these other personal identifying information about me, because you don't need to see it. And I control that data, and I control who sees it. So to kind of extrapolate that out, imagine where, like, instead of social media asks, they can sell our data, and we allow them to sell what we decide they can sell, and then they reward us in cryptocurrency. So that's kind of again, a remedial example of how the blockchain identity stuff works, but we're really focused in this space on verifiable credentials. So I'm in business school right now. When I was applying, I had to go back to University of Redlands, where I did my undergrad, and get all my transcripts and all that kind of stuff. Cumbersome process. It costs money to do. Like, why don't I just own those, and why can't I just access those to give to Seattle U as I'm applying for, their MBA program? So, quick example in supply chain and in identity, but there's a ton of other places where this, where there's implications. So it doesn't mean that every problem that comes up in this space, blockchain is the answer for, but these are some of the different areas that people are working on. And the list goes on. This is by no means exhaustive, but it's kind of representative of all the random different places that that blockchain can help create efficiencies or give ownership of data back to the people whose data it is. So, looking at this, there's some big industries in here. And so that's why the future of blockchain is potentially very big. So based on a recent Gartner, I forget exactly when it came out a couple of years ago, but these numbers look similar as you look at different studies, but this is going to be a massive industry in the future. And so that's one reason why we're focused on it right now, is we need to build we want Washington and the Pacific Northwest to play a role in the future of blockchain, which means we need to start focusing on it now. We need to start building the workforce for it now. We need to increase not just the technical fluency, but the literacy for folks who are, if you're majoring in accounting or finance, you should be aware of the implications that blockchain can have on those industries. And so that's something we're working with schools on, is how do we create more blockchain curriculum, and how do we implement not just blockchain, but for us, blockchain and quantum computing, but how do we implement the sort of impact of some of these technologies into non-technical degrees, so that they have the literacy to be able to talk about these and understand what are use cases and new solutions that these technologies can play a role in healthcare, financial services, all that kind of stuff. All right, so that's kind of the quick 101 and where we're going, and it's going to be a huge industry, so that's why we're excited. But some stuff happening in the Northwest. So here, I'm not going to read all these, but here's a ton of different startups that are working in the Northwest in a few different areas. There's been some, I guess, to pick out one, like Lumedic is one that we work with a lot. They were acquired by Providence a few years ago. They work in pre-authorization for surgeries. So if you need to get authorized for surgery, there's all these different intermediaries you have to go to, and it can take days, weeks. I'm sure it's taken people months to get that authorization. And why? And it's just because, again, there's all these different systems that don't talk to each other, and all these people in the middle that are making decisions and having to be a part of the conversation. when they don't necessarily have to be. And so that's where Lumetics use case started, but they're building out a bunch of other identity solutions in this space using both blockchain and non-blockchain solutions. And there's a ton of enterprises in the space. So these are just the large companies that we've talked to in the past about blockchain, or that we're currently working with, who are interested in the space or actively working in it. So Starbucks, they've used a company to help track coffee beans and where those came from. Microsoft, Amazon, folks like that are doing blockchain as a service. Boeing is around supply chain. I'll get into all these, but Expedia is thinking about like reward systems and how to use NFTs for things like that. So there's a ton of interest in the space, not just from startups, but also from large companies, which provides some signal that this is an important technology and something that we should be thinking about, even though it's still pretty nascent. So as far as some of the stuff that we're working on and why we think the Pacific Northwest is going to become a good hub for blockchain, and not included in this is the just sort of technical capacity and knowledge that I mentioned earlier. But because of how technical of a community we're in, that gives us an advantage when we're working on these types of really technical challenges. But for just some sort of stuff we're working on. So we started the Cascadia Blockchain Council 4 years ago. I've been doing a bunch of work around educating policymakers and investors. I've been looking around, we talked with government agencies about use cases. Like we talked to the King County Regional Homelessness Authority not too long ago. We connected the Helen Keller Museum and the American Foundation for the Blind to folks who can help create NFTs so that they can digitize some of their artifacts and sell that as a revenue stream. And many other use cases. But we've been growing that program over the last 3-4 years to now we are helping corral 25, 30 states together to work on a more national strategy. So we've been working pretty closely with Oregon, California, and in Vancouver, BC, but particularly in Oregon and California around policy stuff, especially related to trust frameworks for verifiable credentials. But now, we're working with Texas, we're working with Wyoming, we're working with Utah, we're working with North Carolina, all kinds of places across the U.S. Where we're and federally to try and create this more cohesive national strategy. So there isn't 50 different regulation and compliance and legislative hurdles you have to go through. Because, for good reason, there's a lot of regulation in financial services, but sometimes that can be cumbersome when you're coming in with new innovations. So related to that, the Department of Financial Institutions has been a partner of ours for the last couple of years. We do like an annual town hall with them. The next one's coming up in September. But they also, with some of our help and sort of listening to the community, created this Center for FinTech on the DFI site. So startups who are creating FinTech companies can go to that DFI site and look around and see what are the regulations and compliance hurdles that I need to be aware of, and what are resources that I can use to make sure I'm doing this correctly. And so this is a site that launched about a year ago, but there's a lot of back and forth with us, the community, DFI, to make sure that this was responding to the needs that the community had. We also won a grant from the Department of Commerce about 6 months ago to create the Advanced Technology Cluster in the region, which again focus on blockchain and quantum computing. And in addition to the policy stuff we're doing, a lot of workforce development and startup development. And we're still kind of early in that project, but again, it's how do we make sure that this region is a part of the conversation on blockchain going forward? Because there's no reason that we shouldn't be, and the only reason we won't be is if we just kind of rest on our laurels or don't get out of our own way, basically. So like I mentioned in when I was up there previously, there was legislation in Washington that passed this past legislative session to create a working group. We're going to start meeting as a group probably later this summer. We WTIA will definitely be working on some policy initiatives for the session next year, but this working group is going to last until the end of 2023, when it'll come out with a bunch of recommendations about what we need to do as a state to invest in this and what regulation we need to propose or legislation we need to propose to make sure that we're doing this correctly. So we plan to be very busy the next few years from a policy perspective, and we have some great allies. Mayor Robinson from Bellevue is part of our blockchain committee representative Cindy Ryu. Senator Sharon Brown was really instrumental in what we've been working on the last couple of years. And so we're pretty confident that one of the pieces of legislation we'll propose next year, which actually made it pretty far in the session this year, but sort of died near the end, is a trust framework around verifiable credentials and bringing in universities and folks like that to look at how can they use verifiable credentials to improve on what they're doing now. And then I mentioned this earlier too, but this is a trend that we're seeing a lot more blockchain and fintech startups in our accelerators doing all kinds of different things. And we're seeing more interest from investors and others in this space. So we think the future is really bright in the Northwest. And like I said earlier, there's no reason we shouldn't be a global epicenter for this technology. And, you know, we think if we continue down this path, we definitely will be, because Washington is playing a leading role in the national strategy around blockchain, doing everything from responding to the Federal Reserve about they sent out a request for information around central bank digital currencies. And there's a bunch of things like that the federal government in general is really interested in learning about. And so we're working with all these other states to make sure that we have a cohesive messaging and cohesive policy strategy. And again, we're not creating a bunch of different things in silos and a bunch of legislation that forces companies to figure out 50 different ways to operate. So yeah, that's everything I've got. I don't think I went over time, but if I did, chastise me later. Yeah, and I'll stick that FinTech site link here in the chat for anyone who's interested or who knows startups in the space, or if you are a founder and you're interested in how do I operate in Washington, that site's a good place to start.
Thank you very much, Nick. My gosh, you gave us an avalanche of information right at the end.
I did.